Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. The warm Mesopotamian night surrounds us as we settle into this ancient temple courtyard in Eridu, the first city where the air still hangs heavy with incense and possibility. The year, if we can even call it that, hovers somewhere around 5400 BCE, though the Sumerians themselves would laugh at our need to number everything so precisely. They measure time differently here, in floods and harvests, in the reigns of kings whose names will echo for millennia, in the comings and goings of beings they call the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. You can feel the reed mats beneath you, woven tight against the packed earth floor, still holding the day's heat even as the evening breeze whispers through the open temple entrance. Somewhere in the distance, the Euphrates murmurs its eternal song, that patient river that has witnessed everything that's about to unfold. The clay tablets stacked against the far wall catch the lamplight, their surfaces smooth and waiting, though writing itself won't truly arrive for another 1,000 years or so. For now, there are only symbols, marks, attempts to capture the uncapturable, the moment when everything changed, when the sky opened and the gods decided that this particular patch of marshland and possibility would become the cradle of civilization. No pressure or anything. Now, I should warn you, you probably won't survive this. Not literally, of course. You're perfectly safe in your bed, though your concept of ancient history might take a bit of a beating. We're about to wade into interpretations that range from the academically sound to the delightfully unhinged, and somewhere in that spectrum lies something resembling truth, or at least a really compelling story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not interested in pity subscriptions or algorithm appeasement. If this strange blend of history and speculation speaks to you, wonderful. If not, no hard feelings, truly. While you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something beautifully synchronous about people scattered across the globe, all tuning in to the same ancient frequency, all choosing to spend their precious sleep hours contemplating whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials, metaphors, or just really well-connected aristocrats. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Temple of Enki at Eridu rises before us, not yet the massive ziggurat it will become, but already impressive in its ambition. Imagine a structure of mud brick and reed, carefully plastered and painted, sitting at the edge of the marshlands where fresh water meets salt water, where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The priests move about their evening rituals with practiced precision, their white linen robes catching the lamplight as they prepare offerings for the god who dwells here. Enki, Lord of the sweet waters, keeper of the me, those mysterious divine powers that govern everything from kingship to brewing beer. Yes, the Sumerians had a specific divine power for brewing beer. Priorities, people. Excellent priorities. Here's what we know from actual, verifiable, peer-reviewed archaeology. Eridu was indeed the first significant Sumerian settlement, occupied continuously from approximately 5400 BCE until it was abandoned around 600 BCE. The temple sequence at Eridu shows 17 superimposed building levels, each new temple built directly atop the ruins of the last, creating a physical record of nearly 5,000 years of continuous worship. The earliest temples were simple one-room structures with an offering table and altar, but even these modest buildings were carefully oriented and decorated, suggesting that whoever worshipped here took their devotions seriously from the very beginning. The Sumerians themselves considered Eridu the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, where the very concept of civilization took root in willing soil. But here's where things get interesting, where the academic meets the alternative, where the fringe theories start waving enthusiastically from the margins of respectability. According to Zecharia Sitchin and his spiritual descendants in the ancient astronaut hypothesis crowd, the Anunnaki weren't merely gods in the mythological sense. They were physical beings from a planet called Nibiru, arriving on Earth roughly 450,000 years ago with mining equipment and questionable labor practices. In this interpretation, Eridu wasn't just a temple, it was a landing site, a base camp, the place where Enki established his operations after splashing down in the Persian Gulf. The sweet waters he controlled? Not metaphorical at all, but literal resource management, the fresh water necessary for survival and for the complex genetic engineering these cosmic visitors supposedly undertook. Every ritual, every offering, every prayer the priests perform tonight is actually a cargo cult callback to actual spacecraft and actual astronauts who once walked these very marshes. Now, before your inner skeptic starts throwing academic papers at the screen, let's sit with this interpretation for a moment. Not because it's necessarily true, scholarly consensus would suggest it's definitely not true, but because it reveals something fascinating about how we read ancient texts, how we project our contemporary anxieties and aspirations backward through time. The Sumerians themselves wrote that the Anunnaki came from the heavens. They described these beings as possessing technology and knowledge far beyond human capacity. They depicted them in art as arriving in mysterious objects that, if you squint and really want to see it, might resemble spacecraft. When Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976, he wasn't entirely fabricating. He was interpreting, translating, choosing to read metaphor as literal history. Wrong? Probably. Interesting? Absolutely. The scholarly debate around Sumerian religion and the Anunnaki centers not on whether they were aliens, that's not even a serious academic question, but on what these myths tell us about Sumerian society, power structures, and cosmology. Professor Thorkild Jacobson in The Treasures of Darkness argues that Sumerian gods represented natural forces personified, divine politicians managing a cosmic state. The Anunnaki were the great gods, the decision-makers, distinguished from the Igigi, the lesser gods who did the actual work. This hierarchy mirrors Sumerian social organization so perfectly that it's either a divine template for human society, or, more likely, a human template for divine society. We organize heaven the way we organize earth because that's the only organizational system we understand. The gods have councils and assemblies because we have councils and assemblies, not the other way around. Meanwhile, the fringe interpretation looks at this same evidence and sees something else entirely. Why would the Sumerians describe their gods as coming from the heavens unless they actually came from the heavens? Why the detailed descriptions of divine objects and vehicles? Why the insistence that these beings brought knowledge and civilization to humanity? In this reading, what mainstream scholars dismiss as mythology is actually garbled history, the best attempt of primitive humans to describe advanced technology using the limited vocabulary available. A spacecraft becomes a chariot of the gods. Genetic engineering becomes the gods fashioned humanity in their image. Mission briefings become divine councils. And Eridu, our sleepy temple town here, becomes Launchpad Zero for the greatest intervention in human history. Let's pause here to appreciate the sheer audacity of both interpretations. Mainstream scholarship asks us to believe that human beings, without any divine or extraterrestrial intervention, spontaneously developed agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and epic poetry. Just woke up one morning and decided to invent civilization from scratch. No big deal. The alternative interpretation asks us to believe that ancient astronauts traveled across the cosmos to dig for gold using genetically engineered slave labor. Both scenarios, when you really think about them, require substantial suspension of disbelief. One is just more academically respectable than the other, which is a weird criterion for truth when you stop to think about it. Yes, this theory is completely implausible, but at least we publish it in peer-reviewed journals, isn't quite the devastating argument it pretends to be. Back in the temple, the evening ritual continues. A priest, let's call him Enlil Nada because that's an actual Sumerian name and it means Enlil is glorious, which is either sucking up to the gods or stating facts depending on your perspective, approaches the altar with a bowl of dates and a small fish from the morning's catch. The fish still smells of the marshes, of mud and life, and as Enlil Nada places it carefully on the offering table, he chants in the ancient tongue, words that predate even Sumerian, phrases inherited from whoever lived here before the Sumerians arrived. The melody is haunting, sliding between notes in a way that Western ears find almost unsettling, and the other priests join in, their voices blending in the thick evening air. What is Enlil-Nada thinking as he performs this ritual? Does he truly believe, that Enki dwells here in this physical temple, that the god consumes these offerings, that the prayers reach divine ears? Or is this theater, elaborate performance art sanctified by tradition and supported by the political structure that depends on divine legitimacy? The honest answer is probably both, simultaneously, without contradiction. Humans are remarkably good at holding multiple truths at once, at performing rituals we half believe while completely believing, at going through motions that nevertheless move us. Every culture, every era, every religion performs this same dance between literal and metaphorical truth. The Sumerians didn't have a monopoly on creative theology. They just wrote it down first, which means we get to argue about it 5,000 years later. Lucky them. Here's a quirky detail that doesn't make it into most ancient astronaut theories, but absolutely should. The Anunnaki had a passion for beer. Not metaphorical beer, not divine ambrosia, actual beer. The fermented beverage that required cultivation of grain, which required agriculture, which required settling down in one place. Multiple Sumerian texts describe the gods drinking beer, getting drunk on beer, making important cosmic decisions while absolutely hammered on beer. The hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, is simultaneously a praise poem and a recipe. You can literally brew Sumerian beer using that hymn as your instruction manual, and archaeologists have done exactly that, because apparently getting drunk on historically accurate ancient beer is a legitimate research methodology. Academia is wonderful sometimes. Now, if the Anunnaki were advanced extraterrestrials, why the obsession with beer? Did they travel across the galaxy to get tipsy on fermented grain water? Is beer a universal constant, beloved by intelligent life forms throughout the cosmos? These are the questions that keep alternative historians up at night, and honestly, they're not wrong to wonder. The presence of beer in divine contexts is genuinely weird when you think about it. Either the gods have remarkably human appetites, or humans project their own preferences onto the divine, or, and here's where it gets fun, advanced beings from space genuinely appreciate a good brew. That last option is no more or less weird than the idea that they came here to mine gold, which is the standard ancient astronaut claim. If you're already buying into cosmic mining operations, why not cosmic breweries? The mainstream scholarly position on divine beer is, predictably, less exciting but more coherent. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't just a beverage, it was nutrition, currency, social lubricant, and sacred offering all rolled into one. It was safer to drink than water in many cases. It provided calories and vitamins. It could be stored and transported. Offering beer to the gods made perfect sense because beer represented wealth, sustenance, and the successful completion of the agricultural cycle from planting to harvest to fermentation. When Enlil-Nada offers beer to Enki, he's not just getting a deity drunk, he's presenting the distilled essence of civilization itself, the transformation of raw nature into human culture. That's actually pretty profound, even without the alien intervention. The debate about the nature of the Anunnaki extends beyond gods versus aliens into more subtle theological territory. Were they originally human ancestors, deified after death? Were they Sumerian attempts to explain natural phenomena, the Anunnaki as personified thunder, harvest, fertility, war? Were they political propaganda invented by the priestly class to legitimize their authority? Each theory has scholarly defenders, each interpretation finds support in the texts, and none of them are mutually exclusive. The Anunnaki could be all of these things simultaneously: metaphor and memory, politics and theology, human projection and genuine mystery. Professor Samuel Noah Kramer, who devoted his life to translating Sumerian texts, often noted that the Sumerians themselves seemed unclear about the exact nature of their gods. The myths contradict each other, the genealogies don't line up, the stories shift depending on which city-state is telling them. Enki in Eridu is not quite the same Enki in Nippur. Each locale had its own traditions, its own version of cosmic history. This messiness frustrates anyone looking for a single coherent narrative, whether that's academics trying to map Sumerian theology or alternative historians trying to reconstruct alien intervention. The past refuses to cooperate with our need for clean answers. It's complicated, contradictory, and thoroughly human, which might be the most telling detail of all. As the night deepens, more priests arrive for the late evening service. They've spent the day in various tasks, copying tablets in the scribal school, managing the temple granaries, settling disputes among the citizens of Eridu, performing minor divinations for worried farmers. The temple isn't just a religious center, it's the beating heart of civic life, the place where the divine and mundane intersect with bureaucratic precision. One priest, his hands still stained with ink from the day's copying work, makes a small joke about Enki's supposed wisdom, wondering aloud if the great god might spare a bit of that divine knowledge for his aching back. The other priests chuckle softly. Even here, even now, humor survives, that most human response to the overwhelming mystery of existence. If the Anunnaki are watching, one hopes they appreciate the joke. Gods without humor are hardly worth worshipping. The temple architecture itself encodes layers of meaning that scholars are still unpacking. The doorways face east, toward the rising sun, that daily resurrection that never fails to arrive. The interior chambers progress from public to private, from profane to sacred, creating a physical journey toward the divine presence. The walls, plastered smooth and painted with geometric patterns, frame the space with intentionality. Nothing is accidental. Every brick placement, every decorative choice, every spatial relationship embodies Sumerian understanding of cosmic order. When Sitchin and his followers look at temple plans and see landing pads, they're not entirely wrong to see intentional design. They're just wrong about the intention. These weren't coordinates for spacecraft. They were maps of heaven, blueprints for ordering chaos into cosmos, architecture as theology made manifest. Around the temple, the early city of Eridu sprawls in organic clusters. There are perhaps a few thousand people here, living in reed houses clustered around the temple complex, farming the rich alluvial soil, fishing the marshes, raising sheep and goats in the grasslands beyond. They speak Sumerian, that language isolate with no known relatives, that tongue that appeared seemingly from nowhere and revolutionized human expression. Where did the Sumerians themselves come from? The archaeological record shows them arriving in Lower Mesopotamia around 5000 BCE, but their origins remain mysterious. They weren't indigenous to the region, they came from somewhere else, bringing with them sophisticated irrigation techniques, distinctive pottery styles, and religious concepts that would influence human thought for millennia. The alternative historians love this mystery, an advanced culture appearing suddenly with no known predecessors. Obviously alien intervention, obviously genetic engineering, obviously the Anunnaki uplifting primitive humans to civilization. Never mind that archaeology shows clear developmental stages, that the Ubaid culture preceded the Sumerians and contributed significantly to what would become Sumerian civilization. Never mind that sudden in archaeological terms means over several centuries. Never mind that cultural diffusion and innovation can explain everything the ancient astronaut hypothesis attributes to cosmic visitors. Mystery is sexier than methodology. Ancient aliens are more exciting than trade routes and gradual agricultural intensification. We want our history dramatic, revelatory, special. The truth that humans are remarkably innovative and don't need divine or alien intervention to create beautiful, complex civilizations is somehow less appealing than cosmic conspiracy theories. But let's not entirely dismiss the mystery either. The Sumerian King List, a document compiled around 2100 BCE but drawing on much earlier traditions, begins with the statement, "When kingship was lowered from heaven." It lists antediluvian kings who ruled for impossibly long periods. One king supposedly reigned for 28,800 years. After the flood, the reigns become more reasonable, dropping to a mere few centuries before eventually settling into human lifespans. Mainstream scholars interpret this as mythological time, the Sumerian equivalent of once upon a time, a way of saying this happened long ago in the age of heroes. Alternative interpretations read these long lifespans literally, suggesting either non-human rulers or the use of different time scales we don't understand. The debate hinges on how literally we read ancient texts, whether we privilege symbolic or literal interpretation, whether we trust ancient writers to distinguish between myth and history. The priests complete their evening ritual. The offerings sit on the altar, smoke from incense curling toward the reed-thatched roof. prayers hanging in the air like almost tangible things. Enlil Nada performs the final blessing, asking Enki to watch over Eridu, to keep the sweet waters flowing, to maintain the cosmic order that allows civilization to flourish. Is anyone listening? Does Enki actually dwell here in this temple, in this specific physical space? The Sumerians thought so. They believed the gods inhabited their statues, that proper ritual could compel divine presence, that the boundary between heaven and earth was permeable and negotiable. Modern believers often condescend to this ancient perspective, secure in their own sophisticated theology that confines the divine to either everywhere at once or nowhere specific. But the Sumerian view has a certain logical clarity. If gods exist and care about human affairs, why wouldn't they show up? Why remain distant and aloof when you could inhabit a nice temple, enjoy regular offerings, and participate directly in the civilization you supposedly created? The Sumerian gods are refreshingly practical deities, concerned with irrigation and justice, and ensuring the beer rations are distributed fairly. They're not abstract cosmic forces, they're personalities, individuals, beings with preferences and grievances and questionable decision-making skills. In other words, they're remarkably human, which tells us either that humans created gods in their image, or that whoever created humans shared our psychological architecture. Pick your interpretation. As midnight approaches, the temple settles into quiet. The priests retire to their quarters, discussing tomorrow's tasks in low voices. There's a dispute about water rights to adjudicate. A merchant from Ur is arriving to negotiate a grain purchase. Someone needs to check on the ritual purity of the temple sheep. The sacred and mundane blur together seamlessly. This is what religious life actually looks like, not the cosmic drama of myths, but the daily grind of maintaining both divine and human institutions. If the Anunnaki were aliens establishing an Earth base, they apparently spent a lot of time dealing with sheep-related bureaucracy. This either undermines the theory entirely or suggests that advanced civilizations everywhere struggle with livestock management. Both options are kind of beautiful. Outside, the Mesopotamian night spreads vast and star-filled, the same stars the Sumerians are just beginning to name, to organize into constellations, to use for navigation and calendrical calculation. The Anunnaki supposedly came from those stars, and whether we interpret that literally or metaphorically, the human impulse remains the same, looking upward, wondering what's out there, asking whether we're alone. 5,000 years later, we're still asking the same questions, still scanning the heavens for signs of intelligence, still hoping and fearing contact in equal measure. The Sumerians would understand our space programs, our SETI initiatives, our Mars rovers. They were doing the same thing with different technology, reaching toward the cosmos, trying to understand our place in the overwhelming vastness. One final detail before we move forward through time. Eridu had a sacred tree, the Kishkanu, which grew in the holy precinct near Enki's temple. Sumerian texts describe it as planted by Enki himself, with roots reaching to the underworld and branches touching heaven, connecting all three cosmic realms. It's remarkably similar to other world tree myths, Yggdrasil in Norse tradition, the Tree of Life in various cultures, even the biblical Tree of Knowledge. Either this is convergent mythology, different cultures independently developing similar symbolic structures, or it's cultural diffusion, the idea spreading along trade routes and mutating with each retelling. Or, and this is where the fringe theories get excited again, it's universal memory, all human cultures remembering an actual tree or an actual thing that got metaphorically transformed into tree imagery over millennia. The Kishkanu, whatever it was, stood here in Eridu as the world's first city took shape. People saw it daily, touched it perhaps, certainly thought about it, told stories about it, wove it into their understanding of cosmic architecture. And now it's gone, as completely as if it never existed. No archaeological trace, no physical evidence, just words on tablets describing something that may have been metaphor from the start. This is the nature of history at this distance. Fragments, suggestions, possibilities. We rebuild the past from shards and hope we're getting the overall picture mostly right, knowing we're definitely getting specific details mostly wrong. The first section of our journey ends here, in Eridu at the beginning. The temple stands quiet under the stars. The priests sleep, dreaming perhaps of divine encounters or more likely of tomorrow's administrative headaches. The Euphrates flows, the marshes rustle with night birds, and the Anunnaki, whether gods or aliens or metaphors or memories, watch over this first experiment in civilization with what we can only hope is patient fondness for the strange, ambitious, perpetually confused species trying so hard to understand where it came from and why it's here. The sun rises over Nippur in 2600 BCE, and we've jumped forward nearly 3,000 years from Eridu's founding. Time moves strangely when you're measuring in millennia. Empires that seem eternal last a few centuries. Religious traditions that feel ancient are merely middle-aged. The Sumerian civilization, which began with those humble reed temples in the marshlands, has matured into something spectacular and bureaucratic, which is the natural life cycle of all successful civilizations. Start with inspiration, end with paperwork. Nippur sprawls beneath us, a proper city now with 40,000 residents, canals cutting geometric patterns through the urban landscape, massive walls enclosing neighborhoods that each house entire populations larger than Eridu at its founding. The temple of Enlil, chief of the Anunnaki pantheon, dominates the city center, not just one building but an entire complex of courtyards, shrines, workshops, granaries and archives. This isn't your modest mud brick chapel anymore. This is corporate headquarters for divinity, and business is booming. You can smell the city even before you see it. That distinctive ancient urban aroma combining bread baking, beer brewing, incense burning, human and animal bodies in close proximity, the sharp tang of copper being worked in the metalsmith quarter, the earthy scent of fresh clay being prepared for tablets. Cities smell different from villages, and ancient cities smell different from modern ones, more organic, more immediate, more honest about the biological realities of concentrated human existence. Nothing here is sanitized or deodorized, civilization in all its fragrant glory. The mainstream historical fact we're anchoring to is this. Temple complexes in Sumerian cities were indeed the primary economic institutions, functioning as banks, employers, redistribution centers, and manufacturing hubs. The temples owned vast tracts of land, employed hundreds of workers, stored surplus grain that stabilized the economy during lean years, and maintained detailed records of every transaction. We have thousands of these administrative tablets, boring, beautiful, invaluable documentation of who received how much barley, who worked how many days weeding the onion fields, who got paid in beer versus bread versus silver. The temple bureaucrats recorded everything with meticulous precision, creating what is arguably humanity's first big data project. Accounting precedes literature. Expense reports come before epic poetry. This is the unglamorous truth of civilization's origins. But here's where it gets delightfully weird, where the fringe interpretations take this economic data and run with it straight into science fiction territory. According to researchers like Michael Tellinger and his theories about ancient gold mining, these temple granaries weren't just storing food, they were covering up the real operation, which was gold extraction and processing for export to the Anunnaki homeworld. All that barley and beer, payment to workers in a massive mining operation that stretched across Mesopotamia and into Africa. The detailed record-keeping, not just Sumerian obsessiveness but documentation required by off-world management. Every ration of beer, every allocation of bread, every silver payment was actually accounting for labor in the service of alien resource extraction. The temples were human resources departments for an interplanetary corporation. Now, let's sit with this interpretation, not to endorse it, but to appreciate its strange internal logic. It attempts to answer a genuine question. Why were ancient Sumerians so obsessed with gold? They had no practical use for it. You can't eat it, can't make tools from it, can't build with it. Yet they valued it enormously, traded for it extensively, stockpiled it in temple treasuries. Mainstream archaeology explains this as prestige economics. Gold is valuable because it's rare and pretty and doesn't tarnish, making it perfect for displaying wealth and creating objects of permanent beauty. The alternative explanation suggests gold was valuable because the Anunnaki needed it, possibly for atmospheric restoration on their home planet, possibly for technology we can't comprehend. Humans valued gold because the gods valued gold. and the gods valued gold for reasons that had nothing to do with aesthetics or prestige. The scholarly debate here centers not on aliens, but on the nature of Sumerian temple economy. Professor Mark van der Meerup in The Ancient Mesopotamian City argues that while temples were major economic players, they weren't the only economic institutions. Private merchants existed, family businesses operated, market forces affected prices. The temple economy was embedded in a larger economic ecosystem, not the totalized system it's sometimes portrayed as. Meanwhile, other scholars like Johannes Renger emphasize the redistributive function of temples, seeing them as primitive socialist institutions ensuring that resources flowed to those who needed them. The temple as welfare state essentially, collecting surpluses and distributing necessities. Both interpretations have textual support. Both acknowledge the same evidence. They just emphasize different aspects, tell different stories about what all that careful record-keeping actually meant. Were the temples benevolent redistributors ensuring social stability, or were they extractive institutions enriching the priestly elite? The answer is probably yes, both simultaneously, depending on the era, the city, the specific administrators involved, and how one defines benevolence versus extraction. Institutions are complicated, motives are mixed, the past resists simple narratives. Let's walk through the temple complex now. Follow a priest named Enlil as he begins his morning rounds. He's mid-level management in the celestial bureaucracy, responsible for supervising the agricultural workers who tend temple lands outside the city walls. He wakes before dawn, performs his ritual ablutions in water channeled from the temple's private well, dresses in the linen robe that marks his office, and proceeds to the archive room where the day's task assignments are stored on tablets organized by date and work category. This is his life. Ritual and administration, prayer and paperwork, the sacred and mundane so thoroughly entangled that separating them would be meaningless. Here's a fun detail that absolutely delights me. The Sumerian word for temple is which literally means house. The temple is Enlil's house. He lives there, or at least his divine presence lives there, and the priests are basically household staff managing the god's estate. The granaries are Enlil's pantry, the breweries produce Enlil's beer, the weavers make Enlil's clothes, the agricultural workers farm Enlil's fields. This isn't metaphor, this is how they conceptualized it. The god owns everything, and humans are either servants, tenants, or guests, depending on their status. It's feudalism millennia before European feudalism, which suggests either that certain social arrangements are human universals, or that the Anunnaki specifically designed this system for efficient resource extraction. Choose your ontology. Enlil retrieves the relevant tablets and proceeds to the assembly courtyard, where 200 workers are gathering for their day's assignment. They're a mixed group. Some are temple dependents who live on site and receive all their sustenance from temple rations. Others are free citizens fulfilling their labor obligations to Enlil. Still others are prisoners of war or debt slaves working off what they owe. Social class in ancient Sumer is complicated, not the simple slave versus free binary we often imagine. There are gradations, statuses, categories that don't translate neatly into modern terminology. Enlil treats them all with the same bureaucratic efficiency, more concerned with productivity quotas than individual circumstances, which is either admirably egalitarian or depressingly dehumanizing depending on your perspective. The work assignments are specific and detailed. 20 men to the northern barley field for weeding, 15 women to the onion plots for harvest, 10 men to canal maintenance on the western irrigation system, 5 specialists to the date palm grove for pollination. Dates don't pollinate themselves. Someone has to climb 30 feet up with a basket of male flowers and dust the female flowers by hand, which is either meditative agricultural labor or a profound commentary on existence. Payment is calculated precisely, barley rations based on gender and task difficulty, beer allowances that vary by status, occasional silver bonuses for work exceeding quotas. Nothing is approximate, nothing is casual. Every transaction is recorded by scribes who accompany the work gangs, noting exactly who worked how long at what task. Now, if you're an ancient astronaut theorist, this level of documentation is further evidence of off-world management. Why else would Bronze Age humans need such precise accounting? They're clearly reporting productivity to higher authorities who demand quantified data. Every grain of barley, every jug of beer, every day of labor is tracked because someone in orbit, or on another planet, or in a distant Anunnaki facility, is monitoring resource extraction with the same soulless efficiency as any modern corporation tracking quarterly earnings. The temple isn't just bureaucratic, it's cosmically bureaucratic, implementing management systems designed by beings who understand the value of standardized reporting across interstellar operations. The mainstream explanation is less exciting but more psychologically interesting. Humans invented bureaucracy because large-scale cooperation requires tracking and accountability. Once your civilization exceeds Dunbar's number, the roughly 150 people we can maintain stable social relationships with, you need systems that don't rely on personal relationships. You need rules, records, standardization. The temple bureaucracy emerged because Nippur has 40,000 people, and you can't run a city that size on handshake agreements and good intentions. Trust doesn't scale, documentation scales. Bureaucracy is what happens when cooperation succeeds so completely that it becomes impersonal. Ur-Enlil watches the work gangs depart through the temple gates, each led by an overseer carrying a copy of the day's assignment tablet. The courtyard empties gradually, filling with that particular quiet that follows mass departure. Pigeons return to peck at spilled grain. A cat emerges from the granary shadows, looking smugly satisfied with itself, probably having solved the mouse problem with extreme prejudice. Ur-Enlil makes a mental note to ensure the cat receives its daily ration. Even pest control gets paid in this system, though cats negotiate their own contracts and accept payment with magnificent indifference. The priest's next stop is the weaving workshop, where 40 women work massive looms producing textiles for the temple's various needs and for trade with other cities. The workshop is shaded but still warm, the sound of shuttles rhythmic and almost hypnotic. These women are specialists, skilled laborers who've trained for years to achieve the precision required for the finest weaves. They produce linen for priestly robes, wool blankets for temple dependents, decorated fabrics for ritual use, and luxury textiles for export. Their work is valuable, and their rations reflect this. They receive more and better food than field workers, plus regular clothing allotments and occasional luxury items like perfumed oil. Specialization creates hierarchy, and hierarchy is rationalized through elaborate systems that make inequality feel natural, inevitable, divinely ordained. Here's something that doesn't make it into most textbooks but absolutely should. The Sumerian textile industry was primarily staffed by women, and some scholars argue that this created a form of economic power that women in many subsequent cultures would lose. Women controlled production of valuable trade goods. They had specialized skills. They worked outside the home in organized workshops. Whether this translated into actual social power is debated. Control of production doesn't automatically mean political influence, but it's at least suggestive that early urbanization created economic roles for women that later periods would restrict. Civilization is not a linear march toward gender equality. Different eras and cultures negotiate gender dynamics differently, and sometimes the ancient world offers surprising configurations that challenge our assumptions about historical progress. Ur-Enlil inspects the current production, checking quality against the standards maintained by the workshop supervisor, an older woman named Ninsun whose authority in textile matters is absolute. She's been managing this workshop for 30 years, knows every worker by name and skill level, can estimate thread counts by touch, and runs her operation with the fierce efficiency of someone who takes pride in excellence. If the Anunnaki are watching, they should be impressed. If they're not watching, well, Ninsun doesn't need divine oversight to maintain her standards. Some people are just constitutionally incapable of producing mediocre work. The morning progresses through similar inspections. The brewery, where beer production operates on a schedule calibrated to ensure constant supply without excess inventory. The bakery, where bread in various qualities gets distributed according to elaborate hierarchies. fine wheat bread for priests, barley bread for dependents, mixed grain bread for workers, and presumably something even less appetizing for anyone who's seriously annoyed the temple administration, though that doesn't make it into the official records. The smithy, where copper tools are produced and repaired, where the scent of hot metal and the sound of hammering create an atmosphere of industrial determination. Each operation runs with precision that would impress modern efficiency consultants. The Sumerians invented management science along with writing, law codes, and beer-soaked poetry. Multitasking champions. By midday, Enlil returns to his office, a small room in the administrative wing with a window overlooking the central courtyard, a desk made of precious wood imported from distant Lebanon, and shelves stacked with tablets documenting every transaction he's supervised in his 15 years of service. He keeps meticulous records because the chief administrator keeps meticulous records because Enlil, they believe, keeps meticulous records of absolutely everything. Divine accounting, cosmic bookkeeping, the universe as ledger. It's theology that produces really good data, which is probably why we know so much about Sumerian economic life and comparatively little about their emotional interiority. They wrote down the beer rations but not their feelings about distributing beer rations, priorities that future archaeologists will have opinions about. Here's where the quirky fringe interpretation gets really creative. Some alternative researchers look at all this administrative precision and suggest that the tablets themselves were more than records. They were communication devices, encoded messages using a script that only appears to be accounting, but actually contains data in a format readable by Anunnaki technology. Every beer ration is also coordinates. Every textile count is also instructions. The tablets are covering for technology so advanced we wouldn't recognize it even if we found it, which is conveniently unfalsifiable, but also kind of brilliant in its way. If your evidence looks exactly like mundane accounting, claim the mundane accounting is actually coded intelligence, and suddenly the absence of extraordinary evidence becomes evidence itself. It's the interpretive equivalent of, the check is in the mail. Impossible to disprove, unlikely to be true, but maintaining plausible deniability through sheer audacity. The scholarly response to this sort of thing is usually exasperated silence, but occasionally someone takes the bait and points out that we can actually read Sumerian quite well, that the accounting tablets are clearly accounting tablets, that proposing secret encoded meanings requires ignoring everything we know about the script, language, and context. But here's the thing. Even mainstream scholarship acknowledges that we don't understand everything about Sumerian culture. There are ritual texts we can translate but don't fully comprehend. There are practices that seem bizarre or inexplicable. There are gaps in our knowledge, and gaps invite speculation. The problem isn't speculation itself. Scholarship depends on creative hypothesis, but speculation that ignores contrary evidence or requires conspiracies of silence across millennia. Good speculation constrains itself with data. Bad speculation treats data as obstacle to overcome. Enlil spends the afternoon in the scribal school, teaching young boys the fundamentals of cuneiform. This is how literacy perpetuates itself, through grueling apprenticeship where students spend years copying standardized texts before they're allowed to compose anything original. They begin with simple signs, practice on broken pottery shards, graduate to clay tablets only when they've demonstrated consistent accuracy. The teacher's first rule, neat handwriting is sacred. Sloppy cuneiform offends the gods and wastes clay, not necessarily in that order. Young Nanalu, showing promise, receives praise for his careful replication of a hymn to Enlil. Young Namu, showing less promise, receives a sharp swat on the hand for producing signs that look like drunk spiders wandered across his tablet. Ancient education, like modern education, operated through a mixture of encouragement and low-grade trauma. Some things never change. The alternative historians look at Sumerian education and see something else. Deliberate knowledge restriction, the priestly class hoarding literacy to maintain power, possibly concealing Anunnaki secrets from the general population. Only priests and scribes can read. Only priests and scribes know what the tablets really say. This is information control, gatekeeping, the manipulation of knowledge to preserve hierarchy, which, okay, yes, that's exactly what it is. But it's that way for boring political reasons, not because of ancient alien conspiracies. Literacy takes years to acquire. Teaching it widely would require resources ancient societies didn't have. Limiting literacy to specialists isn't mysterious, it's practical. Suspicious minds see conspiracy where there's merely the ordinary operation of power protecting itself through the control of specialized knowledge. As evening approaches, Enlil participates in the daily offering ritual at Enlil's main shrine. This is his primary religious duty, the reason he became a priest in the first place, before administrative responsibilities consumed most of his time. The ritual is ancient, unchanged in its essentials for centuries, a precise choreography of gesture and chant and offering, barley bread, dates, beer, incense, the same products the temple economy produces all day, now consecrated and presented to the god whose house this is. The other priests join in, their voices blending in harmonies that somehow feel both human and otherworldly. This is the moment when the bureaucrat becomes priest again, when the sacred purpose underlying all that administration becomes palpable, present, real. Does Enlil actually receive these offerings? Does divine presence inhabit the statue standing in the shrine's inner sanctum? Enlil believes so, though his belief is textured with complexities we might recognize. He knows the statue was carved by human hands, that craftsmen made it from precious materials according to established specifications. He knows that Enlil the cosmic force is not literally contained in this object, but he also knows that through proper ritual, through correct procedure, through faithful service, something happens here. The divine reaches toward human, the boundary becomes permeable, the offerings are consumed, not physically perhaps, but in some way that matters. Prayer works, or at least does something, or at minimum creates the psychological space for humans to feel connected to powers beyond themselves. Even priests who understand the mechanics of ritual can participate fully in its mystery. Sophistication and faith aren't opposites. The ritual concludes. The offerings sit before the statue, candlelight making the god's face seem almost alive, almost aware. Enlil files out with the other priests, satisfied with another day's service completed competently, if not perfectly. He returns to his quarters, eats a simple meal of bread and onions and beer, reviews tomorrow's work assignments one final time, and settles onto his reed mat for sleep. His dreams, if he remembers them, probably involve tablets and ration calculations and the small anxieties of middle management in any era. Gods might walk through those dreams occasionally, offering cryptic advice or criticism. The unconscious makes its own offerings, processes its own mysteries. Meanwhile, in the temple archives, thousands of tablets sit in careful organization, documentation of decades of transactions, agreements, inventories, judgments, hymns, myths, letters, receipts, the full spectrum of human record-keeping. This is what survives, what will last long enough for archaeologists to eventually find. The emotions don't preserve. The conversations evaporate. The daily irritations and small joys of life in Nippur vanish with the people who experience them. What remains is the bureaucracy, the accounting, the evidence of obsessive record-keeping that tells us how the system worked without revealing much about how it felt to live within that system. Future researchers will know exactly how much beer Enlil distributed, but not whether he enjoyed his work. They'll have productivity quotas, but not job satisfaction surveys. The archive preserves what the administrators thought worth preserving, which shapes what future generations can know about the past. The Anunnaki, if they're watching, if they ever watched, witness all of this with what we hope is appreciation for human effort. This civilization in the floodplain, this experiment in coordinated complexity, this massive collaborative project of turning river valley into city-state, it's either the natural evolution of a clever species or the deliberate design of cosmic interventionists. Either way, it's impressive. Either way, it matters. The temple economy, for all its bureaucratic tedium, represents something unprecedented in planetary history. Large-scale cooperation among non-kin, sustained across generations, creating surplus and culture and writing and mathematics and law. That's worth documenting meticulously, worth preserving, worth transmitting to whoever comes next. As Nippur settles into sleep, the city's 40,000 humans going about their evening routines, the temples standing watchful in the darkness, the canals reflecting starlight, we pause to appreciate this moment in the middle of Sumerian civilization's arc. Not the dramatic beginning in Eridu, not the catastrophic ending still centuries away, but the stable middle period when systems worked, when bureaucracy functioned, when the temple economy successfully coordinated the labor of thousands to feed and house and clothe a population that would have been impossible to sustain without precisely this level of organized complexity. It's not romantic, it's not particularly exciting, but it's the foundation upon which everything else rests. The poetry, the mathematics, the astronomy, the epic literature. You can't have Gilgamesh without the grain rations. You can't have cosmic mythology without mundane accounting. The sacred and profane aren't opposites, but partners in the grand human project of making meaning from mud. Dawn breaks over Uruk in 2700 BCE, and we've moved south along the Euphrates to witness something new in human political organization. Uruk sprawls magnificent and messy across the floodplain, with perhaps 50,000 inhabitants making it the largest city in the world at this moment in history. The massive walls that will someday inspire Gilgamesh's legendary boasts are still under construction, but even half-finished they're impressive enough to make neighboring city-states nervous. Uruk isn't just growing, it's dominating, and that dominance requires new forms of authority, new justifications for power, new relationships between heaven and earth. The smell this morning is particularly intense. Overnight rain has turned the streets into fragrant mud, and 50,000 people plus their livestock create an olfactory experience that would overwhelm modern sensibilities. But for the residents of Uruk, this is just what a city smells like, what life smells like. The scent of beer brewing mixes with incense from multiple temples, bread baking, fish from the market, the indefinable complexity of concentrated humanity. Your nose adjusts eventually, or you go insane. Possibly both. Here's our mainstream historical anchor. Around 3000 BCE, the institution of kingship emerged in Sumer, transforming political organization from temple-centered theocracy to palace-centered monarchy, though temples remained powerful throughout the period. The Sumerian king list claims that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, then moved between cities as dynasties rose and fell. Archaeological evidence shows increasing centralization of power, palatial architecture appearing alongside temple complexes, royal inscriptions claiming military victories and building projects. Kings were not quite divine themselves, that development came later, but they were divinely appointed, chosen by the gods to rule on earth, intermediaries between cosmic authority and human society. This is where it gets interesting, where power claims transcendence, where politics becomes theology. If you're a king, you need legitimacy. Brute force can conquer but can't maintain stable rule. You need the population to accept your authority as proper, natural, inevitable. So you claim divine appointment. The gods chose you specifically to rule. Your authority flows from heaven. Rebellion against you is rebellion against cosmic order itself. It's a brilliant move, really, making political opposition into theological error. The Sumerians didn't invent this strategy, but they documented it thoroughly enough that we can watch it develop in real time through their inscriptions. Now, the alternative interpretation takes this descended from heaven language literally. Of course, kingship descended from heaven. Anunnaki authority structures were imposed on human populations, creating a ruling class that maintained order for the benefit of their cosmic overlords. Kings weren't claiming divine appointment, they were actual appointees, chosen by physically present Anunnaki to govern in their absence. Every royal inscription, every claim to divine selection, every king presenting himself as favorite of the gods, it's all describing actual relationships with actual extraterrestrial beings. The palace isn't competing with the temple. They're two wings of the same management structure reporting to the same off-world administration. Let's examine this through the reign of Gilgamesh, who may or may not have been a historical figure, but who definitely became legendary. The Epic of Gilgamesh, first written down around 2100 BCE but drawing on earlier oral traditions, describes him as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. That's mathematically interesting and biologically impossible, which mainstream scholars interpret as poetic license, mythological exaggeration, the standard hero enhancement that happens when historical figures become legendary. But alternative researchers see something else: evidence of genetic engineering, hybrid creation, the Anunnaki producing rulers with enhanced capabilities through deliberate genetic manipulation. Two-thirds divine isn't metaphor, it's precise ratio of alien DNA to human DNA. The text is telling us exactly what Gilgamesh was: a designed being, purpose-built for rulership. The scholarly debate around Gilgamesh centers on historicity. Was there a real king named Gilgamesh, or is he entirely legendary? The Sumerian king list includes him, giving him a reign of 126 years, which is not quite as impossible as the antediluvian kings, but still stretches credulity. Some archaeological evidence suggests a historical ruler in Uruk around 2700 BCE, who might be the core around which the legends accumulated. But whether there was a historical Gilgamesh or not, what matters is what the epic tells us about Sumerian kingship ideology. The king as intermediary between gods and humans, as builder of walls and temples, as the one who seeks immortality and learns to accept mortality, as fundamentally semi-divine, operating in both worlds simultaneously. Professor Andrew George, whose translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh is definitive, argues that the text evolved over 1,000 years, accumulating layers of meaning, theological development, and literary sophistication. Early versions are different from later versions. The story changes depending on who's telling it and why. This messiness frustrates people looking for a single coherent narrative, whether that's academics trying to establish the original version or alternative historians trying to extract consistent historical information. The epic refuses to be pinned down. It's fluid, multiple, contradictory, like oral tradition, like cultural memory, like any story told and retold across centuries. Let's visit the palace now, where King Enmebaragesi of Kish, a historically verified ruler, unlike Gilgamesh, is holding morning court. Enmebaragesi has just returned from a successful military campaign against Elam, which means captives, plunder, and enhanced prestige. The palace throne room fills with petitioners, officials, priests, merchants, all seeking the king's attention, all operating within elaborate protocols that define who can approach how closely, who speaks first, who's allowed to make eye contact. Power expresses itself through spatial relationships, through access, through the ritualized choreography of hierarchy made visible. Here's a detail that delights me. Sumerian kings often named their weapons, not just sword, but the warrior's pride, or storm that destroys the enemy, or similarly grandiose titles that modern militaries would probably find excessive but that perfectly capture ancient attitudes toward warfare. These weren't just tools, they were almost entities, possessing their own character and agency. The mace that Enmebaragesi carries today, resting across his lap as he receives petitioners, has a name. It's called the Smasher of Mountains, which is delightfully unsubtle. If the Anunnaki designed these power structures, they apparently appreciated good branding. The morning's first petitioner is a merchant disputing a contract. Second is a farmer complaining about his neighbor's irrigation practices. Third is a priest requesting funding for temple renovations. Fourth is a military officer reporting on the integration of Elamite captives into the workforce. Fifth is another merchant, this one seeking royal protection for a trade expedition to Dilmun. The day proceeds through this mixture of commerce, religion, administration, and military management. Being king isn't glamorous. It's mostly dispute resolution and resource allocation with occasional war-making to keep things interesting. Enmebaragesi handles each case with what seems like practiced competence. He rules in favor of the merchant, but not entirely, a split decision that maintains both commercial law and royal prerogative. He lectures the farmer about community responsibility, but doesn't actually resolve the dispute, instead appointing a local official to mediate, which is either wise delegation or convenient buck passing. He approves partial funding for the temple renovation, but attaches conditions about labor contributions from the priesthood. He accepts the military report with a grunt. He grants the trade protection the merchant requested, but demands a significant percentage of profits. This is kingship, balancing competing interests, maintaining authority, using power judiciously enough that people accept the system even when individual decisions go against them. The alternative interpretation sees all of this as performance, theater for the masses, while the real decisions get made elsewhere. Enmebaragesi isn't actually ruling. He's implementing Anunnaki directives, managing human affairs according to instructions from his cosmic superiors. The disputes he resolves aren't real governance, but busy work keeping the population occupied and hierarchical. The military campaigns serve Anunnaki resource extraction goals. The trade expeditions gather materials needed for off-world operations. Every decision, every judgment, every policy ultimately serves the agenda of beings who don't appear in the throne room but whose presence shapes everything that happens there. This interpretation makes Enmebaragesi into either a puppet or a collaborator, depending on how much agency you grant him. It also makes everyone else in Sumerian society into either dupes or victims, people living under a system whose true purpose they don't understand. It's a deeply cynical reading of history, one that denies humans credit for our own political innovations, our own capacity for organization and oppression, our own ability to create hierarchical systems without needing alien instruction. Humans are perfectly capable of inventing monarchy all by ourselves, thank you. We don't need extraterrestrial help to come up with the idea that some people should have power over others. That's a thoroughly human innovation, for better or worse. But let's not entirely dismiss the mystery of early kingship either. There's something genuinely odd about how suddenly it appears, how completely it transforms society, how effectively it maintains itself across millennia. The transition from village councils and temple management to centralized monarchy happens relatively quickly. Within a few centuries, the entire political landscape has reorganized around kings who claim divine appointment and who command resources, labor, and loyalty on unprecedented scales. Maybe this is just the natural evolution of complex society. Once populations reach a certain size, centralization becomes inevitable. Or maybe there's something we're missing about the origins of political authority, some element the texts hint at but we're not interpreting correctly. The Sumerian term for king is Lugal, which literally means big man. Before Lugal, there was En, a term that seems to combine religious and political authority, more priest-king than secular monarch. The shift from En to Lugal represents something significant, the separation of religious from political power, or at least their reorganization into distinct offices that negotiate with each other rather than being identical. The palace competes with the temple. The king and the high priest have different interests, different constituencies, different sources of legitimacy. This creates tension, but also redundancy, checks on absolute power, a primitive version of institutional balance that makes the system more stable even as it makes it more conflicted. By midday, Enmebaragesi retires to the palace gardens for a meal and brief rest. The gardens are his pride, imported trees from distant lands, flowering plants that require careful tending, a small pool where fish swim in lazy circles. This is power-made aesthetic, resources transformed into beauty. A king could distribute this water to farmers. Instead, it feeds decorative plants. A king could use this space for productive agriculture. Instead, it's pure display. Pure pleasure. The garden says, I am so powerful I can afford waste. I am so secure I can indulge in beauty. This isn't just inequality, it's inequality made visible, made intentional, made into art. Sitting here in the shade, eating fresh figs and drinking beer that's been specifically brewed for royal consumption, Enmebaragesi probably doesn't think about Anunnaki overlords or cosmic conspiracies. He thinks about maintaining power, about his rival in Uruk, about whether his son will be capable of inheriting the throne when the time comes. He thinks human thoughts because he's human, operating in human political systems that may have divine justification, but that function through decidedly earthly means: alliances, marriages, military force, economic control, propaganda, ritual display, the sacred and profane again, inseparable. Here's something that doesn't make it into most ancient alien narratives. Sumerian kings were genuinely vulnerable. They got overthrown, assassinated, defeated in battle. If they were Anunnaki appointees, the Anunnaki apparently didn't provide much job security. Dynasties rose and fell. Cities gained and lost prominence. The king list records succession after succession, almost always violent, almost never peaceful transfer of power. This is either evidence that the Anunnaki were hands-off administrators who let local politics play out however they would, or it's evidence that there were no Anunnaki and Sumerian kingship was just as messy and contested as political power everywhere. The afternoon brings military planning. Enmebaragesi meets with his generals. Yes, Sumer had professional military officers, another administrative innovation, to discuss potential campaigns for the coming year. Should they raid into the mountains to capture slaves and metals? Should they march south to intimidate Uruk into accepting Kish's supremacy? Should they focus on defensive preparations given intelligence about possible Elamite retaliation? War is seasonal, agricultural. You fight after harvest when you can feed an army, when young men aren't needed in the fields. War is also economic. It brings captives for labor, plunder for the treasury, prestige for the king. War is ritual. It proves divine favor. It enacts cosmic battles between city gods. It makes the sacred order visible through human violence. The scholarly debate about Sumerian warfare centers on its scale and purpose. Was it primarily raiding and small-scale conflict, or were there actual pitched battles between large armies? The evidence is mixed. City walls suggest genuine military threat. Weapons appear in archaeological record. Inscriptions boast of military victories, but we don't have detailed accounts of specific battles, don't know tactics or strategy in depth, can't reconstruct the experience of Sumerian soldiers with much precision. We know war happened, we know it mattered. We don't know exactly what it looked like or felt like beyond what the king's propaganda tells us, which is always suspect. Alternative interpretations suggest that Sumerian warfare was actually proxy conflict, Anunnaki factions using human armies to fight their own disputes. Each city-state represented different Anunnaki lineages or administrative divisions, and when cities fought, it was really divine politics playing out through human casualties. This makes the Anunnaki seem remarkably petty. You've mastered interstellar travel, but you still fight territorial disputes using primitive human soldiers. But it also has a certain theological elegance. If the gods are just as conflicted and competitive as humans, war becomes cosmic inevitability rather than human failure. We're not fighting because we're fallen or flawed. We're fighting because the divine realm is itself contested. Our violence mirrors theirs. As above, so below. Evening arrives, and Enmebaragesi prepares for the ritual feast that marks the successful completion of his Elamite campaign. This is public display, performance of kingship for the nobles and officials who maintain his power. The palace Great Hall fills with elaborate seating arrangements that encode social hierarchy. Proximity to the king indicates status. Food quality varies by rank. Even drinking vessel materials differ according to position. Everything communicates who matters and how much. The feast begins with prayer to Enlil, acknowledging divine authority as superior to royal authority, maintaining the theological fiction that kings serve at godly pleasure. Then comes the food. Roasted meat from animals sacrificed in celebration, bread, dates, beer in quantities that would concern modern public health officials. Musicians play lyres and drums. Singers perform hymns praising Enmebaragesi's victories. Courtiers laugh at jokes that probably aren't funny but are definitely politically necessary to laugh at. Power celebrates itself, reinforces itself, performs itself for the audience of those who enable it. Watching this scene, you can interpret it multiple ways simultaneously. Its genuine community celebration, the collective marking of successful violence and continued survival. Its propaganda, the king demonstrating power and generosity to maintain loyalty. Its ritual, the reenactment of cosmic order through human hierarchy. Its economic redistribution, surplus wealth flowing from royal stores to elite stomachs. It's all these things at once, which is why reductive interpretations always miss something essential. The Anunnaki explanation misses the thoroughly human political dynamics. The purely materialist explanation misses the genuine religious feeling. The purely religious explanation misses the power politics. Reality is multiple, simultaneous, refusing our need for simple stories. As the feast extends into night and the beer consumption reaches impressive levels, Enmebarajesi performs his final duty as king, distributing gifts to his most important supporters: silver to the generals, fine textiles to the priests, land grants to loyal officials. This is how power maintains itself, through generosity that creates obligation, gifts that bind recipients to the giver. The king who hoards wealth loses power. The king who distributes it strategically builds networks of dependence that outlast any individual relationship. It's brilliantly cynical and genuinely necessary. Power requires constant circulation, constant renewal, constant performance of the relationships that constitute it. The palace finally settles towards sleep, servants clearing the great hall, nobles stumbling to various quarters, the king himself retiring to private chambers where his wives wait with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Tomorrow brings more petitions, more disputes, more administration of the power he claims descended from heaven, but must maintain through decidedly earthly means. Kingship, whatever its ultimate origin, functions through human work, the boring, daily, unglamorous work of making people accept that one person's will should command thousands. Rain falls on Shuruppak in 2900 BCE, and we're going to sit with this rain for a while because it's not ordinary rain. It's been falling for 3 days now, steady and heavy, the kind of rain that seems endless, that transforms landscape, that makes people nervous even though rain is usually cause for celebration in this semi-arid climate. The Euphrates is rising, the canals are full, the streets are becoming streams, and in the temple, the priests are reading omens with increasing concern because this rain feels different, feels wrong, feels like the sky remembering something humans would rather it forgot. Shuruppak sprawls uneasy along the river, 15,000 people going about increasingly wet lives, trying to maintain normalcy even as the water keeps rising. The smell today is mud, just mud, the overwhelming scent of earth saturated beyond capacity, clay returning to its original plasticity, the solid ground becoming unreliable. Livestock huddle under insufficient shelter. Children play in the flooding streets with the oblivious joy of children everywhere, making boats from reed bundles, racing them in the new streams, not understanding that their parents' worried conversations might mean something serious is approaching. Here's our mainstream historical anchor, and it's a significant one. Geological and archaeological evidence confirms that severe flooding occurred in Mesopotamia during the early dynastic period, though exactly when and how severe remains debated. Multiple cities show flood deposits in their stratigraphic record. The Sumerian king list divides history into before and after the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes the flood story as a major episode. So does the Atrahasis epic. So do multiple other Mesopotamian texts. Something happened, something involving water and catastrophe, something significant enough that cultural memory preserved it for millennia, eventually influencing the biblical flood narrative and becoming part of humanity's collective mythological inheritance. But what actually happened? Mainstream geology suggests either an unusually severe seasonal flood, possibly multiple floods conflated in cultural memory, or a tsunami from the Persian Gulf, or catastrophic flooding from upstream, or some combination of these. Nothing supernatural required. Rivers flood. Civilizations built on floodplains get flooded. Sometimes the flooding is catastrophic enough to become legendary. The Mesopotamian flood myth is cultural memory of natural disaster, processed through theological interpretation, transmitted as moral narrative about divine judgment and human survival. The alternative interpretation is considerably more dramatic. According to some ancient astronaut theorists, the flood wasn't natural disaster, but deliberate genocide, the Anunnaki attempting to eliminate their human experiment that had grown beyond their control. The genetic engineering that created modern humans had succeeded too well. Humanity was multiplying, consuming resources, becoming noisy and troublesome. The Anunnaki Council decided on extermination, using their weather control technology or deliberately melting polar ice or triggering some other catastrophic water event to reset the Earth and eliminate the problem population. The flood wasn't divine judgment in the moral sense. It was administrative cleanup, cosmic pest control, the ultimate hostile work environment. Now let's sit with both these interpretations because they're responding to the same textual evidence but reaching wildly different conclusions. The text says the gods sent the flood to destroy humanity. Mainstream scholarship reads this as theological explanation for natural disaster, ancient peoples attributing everything to divine agency, seeking meaning in random catastrophe, processing trauma through narrative. Alternative interpretation reads this as literal description of intentional act, advanced beings deliberately causing catastrophe, the text preserving historical truth that later readers misinterpreted as myth. The scholarly debate centers on the relationship between Mesopotamian flood myths and the geological record. Professor Irving Finkel, curator of cuneiform tablets at the British Museum, argues that the flood narratives preserve memory of real disasters but have been dramatically mythologized, enlarged from regional catastrophe to cosmic event, from historical occurrence to theological statement. The flood happened, but it wasn't global, wasn't divine judgment, wasn't unprecedented in human experience. It was bad flooding, the kind that happens periodically in river valleys, made worse by poor urban planning and insufficient infrastructure. Meanwhile, researchers like Robert Ballard have searched for geological evidence of catastrophic flooding in the Black Sea region around 5600 BCE, suggesting this might be the historical event underlying flood myths across multiple cultures. If a massive flooding event occurred when the Mediterranean breached into the Black Sea basin, populations around those shores would have witnessed seemingly endless water, rising seas, catastrophic transformation of their world. Refugees from such an event might carry flood stories into Mesopotamia, where they'd merge with local flooding experiences to create the composite narrative we inherit. Let's follow Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, as he receives his disturbing divine message. Ziusudra is king of Shuruppak, priest of Enki, and according to the Sumerian flood narrative, the one human who receives warning about what's approaching. In the text, Enki speaks to Ziusudra through the reed wall of his house, literally addressing the wall, telling it what's about to happen, knowing Ziusudra is listening on the other side. It's theologically peculiar, this indirect divine communication. Enki can't or won't directly warn Ziusudra, so he uses this bizarre workaround, speaking to architecture in a voice humans can overhear. Why? The mainstream interpretation suggests this represents theological development, the Sumerians working out how divine will relates to cosmic law. Enlil and the other gods have decreed the flood. Enki opposes this decision but can't directly violate the divine council's ruling, so he finds a loophole, technically not telling Ziusudra but also not exactly not telling him. The gods have rules they must follow even when they disagree with each other. Divine law constrains divine action. It's remarkably sophisticated theology for the 3rd millennium BCE. The alternative interpretation sees something else. Enki as renegade Anunnaki scientist, opposed to the genocide his colleagues have approved, using technological means to communicate secretly with his human favorite. The reed wall isn't just dramatic framing, it's description of communication technology, some device that projects voice or creates the illusion of speaking architecture. Ziusudra isn't hearing a god exactly. He's receiving a covert transmission from a faction member warning him about official policy. It's corporate whistleblowing on a cosmic scale. Ziusudra acts on the warning, which in the Sumerian version is frustratingly fragmented. The tablets are damaged. We have pieces of the story, gaps, ambiguities. We know he builds a boat. We know he loads it with animals and seeds. We know he survives the flood that destroys everything else. We don't have all the details, which drives both mainstream scholars and alternative researchers equally crazy. The story is there but incomplete, like trying to understand a movie from badly damaged film, getting crucial scenes but missing the transitions that would make it all cohere. The boat-building detail delights me for what it reveals about both ancient technology and narrative structure. The instructions Ziusudra receives, at least in the Babylonian version preserved in Gilgamesh, are remarkably specific: dimensions, construction materials, waterproofing techniques, internal compartments. Someone who wrote this down knew about shipbuilding. The narrative includes technical information, not just mythological generality. Either this is sophisticated fiction that includes realistic detail for verisimilitude, or it's historical account preserving actual boat-building knowledge, or it's something in between, cultural memory of how people actually survived flooding, transformed into cosmic narrative about divine intervention. Here's the quirky detail that shows up in multiple versions. The boat is sealed with bitumen, that natural petroleum product abundant in Mesopotamia, used for waterproofing, construction, even medicine. The texts specify bitumen repeatedly, emphasizing this detail as crucial to survival, which suggests either that waterproofing was the memorable technical challenge, or that bitumen had specific significance we're not grasping, or that whoever composed these narratives wanted to include accurate material culture detail. Ancient authors weren't stupid. They knew boats need to be waterproof. They're passing along either practical knowledge or the memory of practical knowledge embedded in theological narrative. The flood itself arrives with appropriate biblical, pre-biblical fury. The skies open. The underground waters surge upward. Every water source simultaneously overflows in coordinated catastrophe that transforms the landscape within hours. Shuruppak disappears beneath the waves. The carefully built temples, homes, granaries, all consumed by water that seems to have no limit, no boundary, no mercy. Ziusudra's boat floats amid the destruction, carrying the biological diversity that will restart civilization after the cosmic reset. Mainstream interpretation, natural disaster mythologized into divine judgment, enlarged from regional flooding to cosmic catastrophe, processed through theological frameworks that saw disaster as meaningful rather than random. The flood happened but wasn't global, wasn't unprecedented, wasn't supernatural. It was very bad weather combined with insufficient infrastructure, killing thousands but not all humanity, traumatic enough to become legendary but not actually world-ending. Alternative interpretation, deliberate catastrophe triggered by advanced beings attempting genocide, thwarted by renegade Anunnaki who preserved genetic samples aboard a technically sophisticated vessel, cosmic reset that eliminated most human population but preserved enough to restart the experiment under new parameters. The boat isn't metaphor, it's description of survival technology, possibly a submarine, possibly a spacecraft, possibly something we don't have words for because we've never seen it. Both interpretations agree on this much. After the flood, everything changes. The Sumerian king list explicitly divides history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods. The kings after the flood have more reasonable lifespans. The cities that re-emerge are different. The world has reset, whether through natural catastrophe or divine intervention or cosmic conspiracy. Something ended, something began, and the dividing line is water. The waters recede eventually, as waters do. Ziusudra's boat comes to rest on dry land. He releases birds to test whether the earth is habitable again. First a dove that returns, then a swallow that returns, finally a raven that doesn't return, indicating successful re-inhabitation of the world beyond the boat. This detail appears in multiple ancient Near Eastern flood narratives and eventually in Genesis, suggesting either cultural borrowing or independent development of the same narrative solution to the same problem. How do you know when it's safe to leave the boat? Ziusudra emerges, makes offerings to the gods, receives divine blessing of eternal life as reward for his obedience and survival. The gods smell the sacrifice, literally smell it. The text emphasizes this sensory detail, and gather around like flies, which is an unflattering simile that somehow made it into scripture. They're hungry. The flood killed their worshippers, eliminated their offerings, disrupted the cosmic economy that depended on human service. Divine and human need each other in Sumerian theology. The gods need worship, offerings, service. Humans need divine favor, protection, order. The flood threatened both parties, which is why even Enlil, who decreed the destruction, eventually regrets it. Here's where the alternative historians make an interesting point. If the gods truly needed human worship and offerings, they weren't omnipotent cosmic forces. They were dependent beings requiring specific resources that humans provided. The whole theological arrangement sounds less like religion and more like economic exchange. Humans provide labor and agricultural products. Gods provide technology and management and weather control and military protection against hostile neighboring gods. It's symbiotic relationship, possibly even parasitic relationship, not worship of transcendent divinity. The Anunnaki needed humans as much as humans needed them, which would explain both the flood genocide, humans had become troublesome, and the post-flood regret, we actually need them. The scholarly response emphasizes that ancient Near Eastern religion generally conceived gods as dependent on human service, that this was standard theology across the region, that it reflected social organization where elites depended on subordinate labor classes. The gods are aristocrats who don't farm their own fields. Humans are peasants who owe service to their social superiors. This mirrors earthly hierarchy because humans create gods in the image of the only social organization they know. It's not evidence of actual dependence, but projection of human social relations onto cosmic scale. Ziusudra repopulates the earth, or at least participates in its repopulation. The cities rebuild, civilization recovers. The king list resumes with new dynasties, shorter reigns, more plausible chronology. We've crossed from mythic time into something approaching historical time, from the age when anything could happen into the age when things happen within normal parameters. The flood is the dividing line, the transformation point, the moment when the extraordinary becomes ordinary, when gods withdraw slightly from direct intervention, when humans take primary responsibility for their own civilization. But the memory persists, preserved in tablets, recopied across centuries, transmitted from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian, eventually influencing Hebrew tradition, eventually becoming one of humanity's most widely known stories. The flood as cosmic reset, as divine judgment, as test of obedience, as catastrophe survived, as new beginning. Every culture that encounters this story adapts it, reinterprets it, makes it their own while preserving the core. There was water, there was destruction, there was survival, there was renewal. As the sun sets on Shurupak after the flood, the city smaller than before, the population diminished but persistent, Ziusudra stands on the rebuilt temple platform looking over the landscape. The waters have returned. Everything is different. Everything is the same. The river still flows. The fields still need tending. The gods still require service. Life continues because life is remarkably resilient, because humans adapt, because catastrophe is never quite final. Whether the flood was natural disaster or alien genocide, the outcome is identical. Humans survived, rebuilt, remembered, transmitted the memory forward so that we're still talking about it 5,000 years later. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through Sumerian origins, through the chronicles of divine touchdown or cosmic conspiracy or human innovation or all of the above simultaneously. We've traced the arc from Eridu's first temple to the flood's cosmic reset, watching civilization emerge from marshland and mythology, witnessing the birth of writing, kingship, bureaucracy, and theology. Whether you believe the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, metaphors, or memories, whether you read these stories as literal history or symbolic truth or sophisticated fiction, we've encountered something profound. Humanity's earliest attempts to answer the fundamental questions about who we are, where we came from, and why we're here. The Sumerian legacy persists in ways both obvious and subtle. Every time you divide an hour into 60 minutes, you're using Sumerian mathematics. Every time you divide a circle into 360 degrees, you're thinking in Sumerian numerical terms. The 7-day week, the zodiac, the very concept of written law, all have Sumerian precedents. But beyond these cultural artifacts, something deeper persists. The questions themselves, the fundamental human drive to make meaning from existence, to create narratives that explain our origins and justify our present. Sitting here in the quiet after all these stories, after temples and economics and kingship and catastrophe, what can we actually conclude? The honest answer is remarkably little with certainty, but much with probability and everything with fascination. The archaeological evidence is clear enough. Humans in southern Mesopotamia developed agriculture, urbanism, writing, complex social organization, and theological systems that would influence civilizations for millennia. These are facts, verifiable through excavation and translation, through the patient work of archaeologists and linguists who spend careers deciphering clay tablets and mapping ancient cities. But the interpretation remains contested terrain. Were the Sumerians describing actual encounters with advanced beings, or were they creating sophisticated mythology to explain natural phenomena and justify social hierarchies? Did the Anunnaki descend from heaven in spacecraft, or did they descend in the metaphorical sense that authority always claims cosmic origins? The evidence can support multiple readings, which is either frustrating or liberating depending on your temperament. The past is not a locked box with a single key, but a conversation across time, with each generation bringing new questions, new methodologies, new interpretations to ancient evidence. The mainstream scholarly consensus has earned its position through rigorous methodology, peer review, and the slow accumulation of evidence that constrains wild speculation. The Sumerians were human, their gods were mythology, their civilization emerged through the same processes of innovation and adaptation that produced every other civilization. This is the safe conclusion, the academically respectable position, the interpretation that requires no supernatural or extraterrestrial intervention, and it's probably correct in its broad outlines, even if specific details remain debated. But the alternative interpretations, for all their speculative wildness, respond to genuine mysteries. The sudden appearance of sophisticated culture, the specific technological knowledge embedded in myths, the astronomical precision of early civilizations, the uncanny similarities between geographically distant mythologies. These aren't imaginary problems, they're real questions that deserve serious attention, even if the ancient astronaut hypothesis isn't the answer. Dismissing all fringe interpretation as nonsense misses opportunities for creative thinking, for asking questions that might lead to unexpected insights, for keeping scholarship honest by refusing to let consensus become complacency. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing between mainstream and alternative interpretations, but in recognizing that both are doing the same thing from different angles, trying to make sense of fragmentary evidence, trying to reconstruct a past that's genuinely mysterious, trying to understand our species' trajectory from prehistory to civilization. We all want to know where we came from. We all seek origin stories that make us feel less random, less accidental, less alone in the cosmos. The Sumerians wanted this too, which is why they created such elaborate cosmologies, such detailed theologies, such careful genealogies connecting human kings to divine authority. The clay tablets that preserve these stories sit in museums now, under climate-controlled conditions, handled with gloves, studied by specialists who devote careers to understanding them. But they were written by people not fundamentally different from us. People who worried about water rights and beer rations and whether their children would remember them. The cosmic drama of gods descending from heaven coexisted with the mundane reality of administrative paperwork, temple granaries, and royal bureaucracy. This simultaneity, this blending of sacred and profane, is perhaps the most enduring Sumerian legacy. The recognition that life is always multiple things at once, that the extraordinary and ordinary intertwine constantly, that meaning and mechanism aren't opposites but partners. As you drift towards sleep now, carrying these stories with you into dreams, remember that you're participating in an ancient tradition. The Sumerians told these stories at night too, passing them along in temple courtyards and palace gardens, in marketplaces and workshops, wherever humans gathered and wondered about their origins. The specific interpretations change. Gods become aliens, become metaphors, become psychological archetypes, become gods again, but the underlying impulse remains constant. We are a species that tells stories about ourselves, that seeks pattern in chaos, that insists existence must mean something even when meaning seems elusive. Let the rain of that ancient flood become the white noise that carries you toward rest. Let the reed walls of Eridu's temple become the walls of your own room, familiar and protective. Let the priests chanting in languages you don't understand become the background hum of existence that continues whether you're conscious of it or not. The Anunnaki, if they're watching, if they ever watched, witness your sleep with the same patient attention they supposedly gave to Sumerian civilization. Remote, mysterious, possibly benevolent, possibly indifferent, definitely beyond our full comprehension. The great gift of Sumerian civilization wasn't their technology or theology, but their willingness to preserve their thinking for future generations, to press their words into clay and fire it into permanence, to believe that what they thought and experienced mattered enough to save. We're the beneficiaries of that preservation, still reading their administrative tablets and epic poetry, still arguing about what they meant and whether they were right. They could have kept their knowledge oral, could have let it evaporate with each generation. Instead, they made it permanent, gave us access to their minds across 5,000 years. So before you subscribe, and please do, if this journey resonated with you, take a moment to appreciate the absurdity and beauty of what we've done tonight. We've traced ancient Mesopotamian history, examined competing interpretations of divine intervention and human innovation, wrestled with questions that have no final answers, and somehow this has been relaxing, soothing, appropriate content for easing into sleep. We've turned cosmic conspiracy theories and academic debates into bedtime stories, which is either profoundly strange or perfectly natural depending on how you think about these things. The Sumerian chronicles end not with resolution, but with continuation. Their civilization eventually fell, conquered by Akkadians, then Babylonians, then Assyrians, then Persians, each successive empire building on Sumerian foundations, borrowing their writing system, adapting their gods, inheriting their administrative traditions. But the ideas persisted, transmitted forward, influencing cultures that would influence other cultures in endless chains of connection, linking ancient Eridu to your bedroom tonight. Sleep well, knowing that the questions we ask tonight are the same questions humans have always asked, that seeking answers is more important than finding them, that the journey through mystery is itself the destination. The Anunnaki, whether they were gods or aliens or projections of human aspiration, would probably approve of your curiosity, your willingness to entertain multiple possibilities, your openness to both skepticism and wonder. Tomorrow you'll wake to a world where Sumer is 5,000 years gone, where ancient aliens remain unproven, where mainstream scholarship continues its patient work of translation and excavation. But for tonight, in the liminal space between waking and sleeping, between certainty and mystery, between ancient past and immediate present, let the Sumerian chronicles wash over you like that original flood, transformative, cleansing, preparing you for whatever new beginning tomorrow brings. Sweet dreams of reed temples and starlit ziggurats, of clay tablets holding secrets, of gods descending and humans ascending, of civilization emerging from chaos, one careful cuneiform mark at a time. The story continues as stories always do, transmitted forward through generations of listeners who keep asking the same essential questions in new words. You're part of that chain now, connected to Sumerian scribes and priests and kings and farmers through the simple act of wondering where we all came from and where we might be going. Rest now. The archive is closed. The tablets are stored. The temples sleep under ancient sands, and you sleep under modern ceilings, carrying forward the Sumerian legacy of preservation, transmission, and the stubborn human insistence that our stories matter, that our questions deserve asking, that the search for understanding is worth pursuing, even when certainty remains forever just beyond reach. End of script. Sweet dreams. Sweet.